Hey, this is Derek, and listen to Skepticality, the official podcast of Skeptic Magazine, for Tuesday, February 28th, 2012.
Skepticality. Science!
Welcome back once again to Skepticality, the show that brings you news, information, and interviews with scientists and skeptics and experts for the promotion of reason and science! Hello once again. We are at Skepticality thank everyone who's been taking the time to help our show by making donations by purchasing our apps for iPhone, Android, and or grabbing our very own copy of the amazing theme song from our website. Each little bit we gain from our online stores really does help me and Swoopy quite a bit. Before we get to our interview, let us once again check in with Tim Farley to learn about this week's Skeptic History.
It's time to spend a few minutes in Skeptic History for March 2012. I'm Tim Farley of whatstheharm.net and skeptools.com. Each edition, we look into history to remember key events of science and skepticism. This edition, we've got pyramid schemes, leap day, and several anniversaries. Although they often have no paranormal or pseudoscience element, scams and frauds figure prominently in skepticism. Analyzing them is often a good exercise in critical thinking. One of the best-known financial scams is the Ponzi scheme. Also known as a pyramid scheme and by other names, its primary characteristic is that the money from newer investors is used to pay false dividends to previous investors. This keeps the illusion of profit going when there is none. In recent years, Bernie Madoff operated a large and infamous such scheme. But the name Ponzi comes from Carlo, or Charles Ponzi, who was born March 3, 1882. He didn't invent the scam now associated with his name, but his particular one was the first to get national press attention in the United States. It began in Boston around February or March 1920 and grew rapidly. By August of the same year, the local press uncovered a prior arrest record and anomalies in his bookkeeping, and it all came quickly crashing down. In modern times, Ponzi schemes have mutated in many ways. One insidious form that often manages to skirt the law is the multi-level marketing scheme. Ostensibly designed to sell a product, these programs often overemphasize the recruitment of new salespeople and burden participants with fees. Typically, only the earliest participants show a profit. One of the most famous multi-level marketing programs is Amway, which has been renamed more than once. It was co-founded by Richard DeVos, who was born March 4, 1926. In 2011, he was the 79th wealthiest person in the U.S. at $4.2 billion. If you'd like to see a dramatization of the human cost of multi-level marketing programs, I highly recommend a recent independent film called Children of Invention. I saw it 2 years ago at a film festival, and it's great. I've only been doing Skeptic History for 3 years, so this week is the first time I've ever been able to cover Leap Day. February 29th, of course, only happens once every 4 years as a way to keep the calendar in sync with the motion of the Earth. I know of 2 skeptic events that actually happened on Leap Day. First, parapsychologist Dean Radin was born on February 29th, 1952. Interestingly enough, he worked as a concert violinist for a time before getting into parapsychology research. Second, the James Randi Educational Foundation, or JREF, was actually incorporated as a nonprofit in the state of Delaware on February 29, 1996. So happy Sweet 16 to the JREF. Another anniversary that happens this week is the 10th birthday of Phil Plate's book, Bad Astronomy, released the first week of March in 2002. Based on the writing he had been doing for years at his identically named website, it helped catapult our bad astronomer to national prominence as both a skeptic and science journalist. I mentioned earlier that I've been doing Skeptic History for 3 years now. In fact, that anniversary just passed on February 16th. I've posted over 1,000 daily Skeptic History facts on Twitter and Facebook over those 3 years. And this week marked 2 years since I've been doing this segment on Skepticality. I'd like to thank Derek and Swoopy for allowing me to be part of the podcast, starting way back in Skepticality number 123. Skeptic History will continue, of course. Links to additional material are in the show notes, and follow me on Twitter or Facebook under the name Krelnik, Krelnik, for a new Skeptic History fact every day.
Thanks again, Tim. This week I sat down with David DiSalvo, a popular science writer and blogger in the world of psychological science. He has a new book out about what can be described as science help, as opposed to self-help. To find out more about the book and David's vision of science help, I convinced him to come on the show and tell us all about what got him into this area of science and what led to a book such as this. Hey, David, how are things going?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
I haven't seen you for a long time. We used to work together a long time ago.
Yeah, it's been about 6 years now.
Yeah, it has been. Oh, a little bit more than I would think. Well, no, actually, right. Yeah, it was around the time I had my stroke that same year we're working some things down in Florida. So, yeah, that's about right. So between then and now, you've become somewhat of a bulkhead in the world of online blogging as far as like psychology and psychiatry. You work with Scientific American Mind and Forbes, which seem to be very different. How'd that happen?
Yeah. I actually started with a blog that was solely my own called Neuronarrative, and that over a course of a couple of years kind of morphed into a few other things, and I developed some relationships at Scientific American and started writing for them on a freelance basis, and then started writing for a startup news forum called TrueSlant, and I wrote for them for about a year. And then they were acquired by Forbes. So that's how I ended up at Forbes.
That makes more sense.
Yeah, but in all those capacities, I've been principally writing about science and technology. My passion focus area has been cognitive science. And the original blog, Neuronarrative, is actually a Psychology Today blog now, so I'm writing with them as well.
Yeah, well, it's funny because in your new book that we're going to be talking about here, you are not a psychologist or psychiatrist, so how did this come about?
That's right. Yeah, I'm not a psychologist, psychiatrist, or for that matter, a neuroscientist. It really came about because of a few reasons. One is that a lot of my professional career outside of writing has been in public outreach and public education. So I started work in that area back in the early 90s. So had a lot of experience in that area, and that has always sparked an interest in me about why people do or do not do certain things that are in their best interest or not in their best interest. So in the public education arena, typically you're promoting a mess. I did a lot of public health work, so you're promoting a public health message to get people to either stop doing something or to begin doing something. And what I noticed over many years of doing this is that you can build awareness and you can even change people's attitudes with effective messaging. But bridge the gap from that to changing behavior is a monumental gap. So that, in addition to a geeky interest I've had in psychology since college, kind of combined to lead me to start researching the topics that would become this book.
And that book is What Makes Your Brain Happy and Why You Should Do the Opposite, which is one of the longest titles for a book we've actually interviewed on the show.
Yes, indeed.
The title alone takes up half of the cover.
That's right. Yeah, and it was kind of by design that way. It was it's obviously a tongue-in-cheek, partly a tongue-in-cheek title, but I actually like the idea of a long title because, people are always saying, well, you need short, pithy titles, and so I thought, well, if everyone's doing short, pithy titles, maybe a long title would be a good differentiator for this book. So that's the direction we went.
Well, like I said, the title takes over half the cover of the book, so I guess on a bookshelf, if it was facing outwards, people might say, what? Is that like the back of the book?
Exactly.
So, can my brain get happy?
Well, your brain, and I early in the introduction to the book, I kind of disclosed my tongue-in-cheekness. Your brain can't, strictly speaking, be happy or be sad or be angry or be anything in terms of emotional parlance. What it is obviously a major component and influencing factor in our being happy or our being fulfilled or so forth. So, but the notion of the happy brain that's explored in the book is actually the flip side of that. It's the things that make your brain, quote, happy. A lot of those things are not in our long-term best interest. They're things that initially seem like the best decision to make or the best direction to go. But what we find is oftentimes in the longer-term view, they're not. So it's actually the flip side of happy that's being explored in the book in a sense, because it's in order to be happy or more fulfilled, a lot of what's discussed in the book are things you're not going to want to do.
And I love that at the beginning of the book, you kind of just lay out right away that something that it just bugs me, because people still debate it, that there's nothing to the whole dualism mind-body problem. And this thing, it's just funny because just today I was getting on, a small discussion with somebody that said that there was some debate about this issue still.
Yeah, there really isn't a debate. The elements of the argument around dualism, they only still exist because we still have a hard time, we in the general sense, have a hard time stomaching the fact that the mind is what the brain and what our nervous system in total does. We would prefer there to be a distinction, because if there's a distinction and the mind is something set apart, then there is, then we can get into discussions of extra dimensionality, in terms of, the mind and the soul being displaced somehow from the biological processes of the body. So it's not a debate in a scientific sense, but it's something that's hard for a lot of people to stomach, so it's still a point of contention.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty much what I've discovered myself by just getting into these discussions with people, is that they just like to have something fuzzy around the edges. Right,
and for a long time, and I talk about this a little bit at the beginning of the book, we would look at the brain and and draw very inaccurate metaphors about brain function, which thankfully in the last 10, 15 years, cognitive science has been slowly debunking. And one of those is that your brain is essentially this aggregate of billions of on-off switches. And so how could anybody who's thinking about this rationally think that, this compact electrical device with billions of on-off switches can produce something as complex as thought? And, there was a period of time when that reasoning caused a lot of consternation. And now what we know is that it's a category area where that is not what the brain is. The brain is so much more than that. And the more cognitive science and neuroscience has been revealing to us how much more it is, the more we're coming to terms with the fact that, yes, the brain is indeed quite capable of producing mind. And we don't have all the answers for that, of course, but we're moving in the direction of getting more and more answers, and that is unsettling, in a lot of people's point of view.
So we're getting closer to the androids?
To the I do in some ways, having read Ray Kurzweil a bit and like-minded thinkers, I do feel like we're moving in the direction of the connected biological, organic, organic mind. As alarming as that sounds in some ways, in other ways not so much, but I don't think we're anywhere near that. Probably in our lifetimes we're not going to see it, but
give it like 300 or 400 years, I guess.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's happening only right now in a very shallow way, because we're just not that far into the development of these technologies, is that we are seeing ways in which technology is integrating with the brain to produce particular functions. And one of the examples of this that's discussed in the book a bit is the ability of technology that's enabling paraplegics to be able to control robotic devices with their mind. This was science fiction 30 years ago. Well, now it's not. It's science happening. So we're certainly seeing movements in that direction, and I think it's fascinating. And you can draw some very negative, dire, dark conclusions about that, and you can also use examples like the paraplegic example and see some very good things.
You mean like people jump to Ed 209 from RoboCop?
Yeah, well, that would be more in the dystopian direction, I think.
Well, about half the book is very apropos to most skeptics, because you outline a lot of logical fallacy type stories, and right off the bat, you had one about when you worked at one of those Quickie Mart type stores, and you talked about this unfortunate robbery and how most people's brains misfire when it comes to logical perception of events. And that was a very high apropos story about what you should and shouldn't do.
Yeah, it reveals, I think, a number of things, that particular story, and one of them is that we are very prone to, that's in a section of the book about framing, and perceptual framing is essentially that we are, we're more than just prone to see things in certain parameters. Our brain actually, depending on the topic, we're actually kind of wired to do so. And if we look outside those parameters, we feel discomfort. So, in the case of that story, one of the things that was challenging to some of the, one of the participants is this: when the guy was trying to stop the robbery from happening, and there was two people who were robbing the store. One was a man, one was a woman. The manager tried to stop the robbery. He immediately went to stop the woman first, because he thought, well, that's my easier, the easier way to go is to stop her. And well, it turned out it wasn't the easier way to go. She ended up, snapping his finger and doing a lot of physical damage to him. And And so, it was the upshot of that is he was working from a very narrow frame, which is that, the woman's the weaker sex, and I am this big tough guy, and I'm certainly able to stop her and thus stop this robbery from happening. And then the second character who comes flying out of the other guy who worked for the store who tried to stop it, his framing was that he had convinced himself that he was this very proficient martial artist, and used to brag about that quite a bit. So he approached the male of the two robbers, and he was, everything about his mannerisms and his tone of voice and everything. He put up this front. Look, I'm formidable. You're going to have to just drop it right here and give up give this up. Well, it turned out his frame was was not at all convincing to the opposition, and he was knocked out. So, it's not a funny story, but the results of it are somewhat humorous. Here are these two guys who launch into a situation wanting to do the best thing, and their perceptual framing led them to make bad decisions.
It just reminds me of something that like Joss Whedon would put in a movie.
Yeah.
Now, it's funny because later on you actually talked about something similar when you talked about the Chi Masters and how they made it seem like they could do all these things because of their followers would, make it like they fall over based on their energy, and then
right.
An MMA fighter came in and, well, solved that problem.
Yeah, that's a very fascinating, still to me very fascinating area, because there's this has a fairly robust following of this particular martial arts style, fighting style called that often the popular term that it goes by is the touchless attack, and critics refer to it as bullshido. But the idea is that at very high levels, the Chi masters who develop the touchless attack, are able to defeat 10, 12 people at a time without ever touching them. They just concentrate their key energy, which is the body force, and project it outward. And they have to, they usually put their hands out, or they make different hand motions. And if you want, and there's several of these videos on YouTube. Anybody could go look this up, and you'll see these guys, and there'll be several of their students are in the dojo with them, and they're just throwing them left and right, tripping them, flipping them, everything, and they never touch any of them. So as you say, in one instance, one of the key masters, who is highly regarded in that arena in Japan, made an open challenge. He said, "Okay, fine, you don't believe this is true. Well, I will not only prove to you this is true, but if you can hurt me, if you can injure me in a fight, I will pay you $5,000." And not surprisingly, someone took him up on it. And unfortunately for this guy, the guy who took him up on it was an MMA fighter who had proficiency in a number of different martial arts. And it took, all 30 seconds for the MMA fighter to just pummel this guy. And it's you're watching it and you think, well, why would anybody expose? I mean, why would you do this to yourself? I mean, it's so clearly, you knew what was going to happen, and it speaks to the strength of confirmation bias, which is, you are so strongly convinced that this thing is the case, this thing is true. And what I really discuss in terms of that story in the book, more so than the confirmation bias of the keymaster, is the confirmation bias of his supporters. Because after this all happened, you would have thought that there would have been, widespread dissension from the touchless attack. Well, there wasn't. It was really what it was a volley of excuses, that the MMA fighter had somehow been able to channel the key energy, or the the keymaster was not feeling well that day, therefore unable to concentrate his energy. I mean, any number of things you can think of.
I remember that one time, James Randi at DragonCon, he told a story about when he was in Japan or China, and one of these chi master guys was doing the same thing, and James Randi realized what was actually going on, so he said, well, let's try it again, but put this curtain up, and he noticed what the chi master was doing that made his followers do it. So he let the guy do it, and then James Randi did it as well, and he did the same exact effect, and the guys did the same thing for James Randi because he realized the guy was actually just making this motion, and his followers had this programmed idea in their head when this one motion happened. That reaction is what their master wanted him to happen. So he was able to do the same exact thing.
That's really interesting. Yeah, the programming aspect there, that these students are essentially, Pavlovian dogs who had learned to react based on hand movements. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and that's when I read that part of the book, I said, yeah, because I remember when Randy told that story, I was like, it's the same thing. It's the same idea. It's that whole confirmation bias that the students even have, that this is going to happen to me, so I have to react.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting story. I had to, of course, be judicious in choosing which to put in a book for sake of length, but there's no shortage of those sorts of stories out there that, on the face of it, they seem just completely ridiculous, and you ask yourself, well, how could somebody believe this? But, they do. And it plays out in sometimes very painful, though enlightening ways.
Oh, it's what makes our brain happy, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's the point, is that I'm quite certain that the students of this, the Chi Master, the story I talk about, are the ones that Randy's talking about. Obviously they're getting something out of being in this class. No one's forcing them to be there. They're feeling fulfilled by it, and we can draw some lessons from that.
After I read this, I might have to start using washing the dog from now on as a phrase that pays when it comes to how people view their lives, because I like that. I like that story because it makes so much sense when you actually go through it kind of point by point.
Yeah, the washing the dog story is something I think, it's such a simple thing. You can substitute any number of things for dog, with the idea there being that you're arguing with your spouse or your significant other about who washed the dog last. And since washing the dog is not something most of us like to do, and each person has their argument set up, and they know exactly why they were not the last person, or they were the last person to do it. And they, I couldn't have been because I had an early meeting that day and I had to leave early, and so forth. But the kind of the goal of describing that is that, when both people are challenged that way, they immediately start coming up with those defenses and are convinced that they're right. Both people are convinced this is absolutely true. And the question is, whose armor gets pierced first and starts questioning themselves? Maybe, when was the last early meeting I had? Maybe that wasn't that today. Could it be that I'm wrong? And, then it becomes less a question of who's right or wrong, but who's going to admit it first, and so it's one of those hits close to home. I've had several people who have read this book who have sent me emails saying, a lot of what you write in this book hits really close to home. In some cases, really uncomfortably close to home.
Especially if you're married.
Right, yeah, exactly.
I love that you say that we are all better off being more like the Doozers and less like the Fraggles. And because I loved that show when it was on back in the day, but it makes so much sense.
Yeah, I was a big fan of Fraggle Rock too, and it's always stuck with me that, and later on, sort of enlightened by research to that on this topic of the fact that we're all kind of wired to be sort of lazy. I mean, we are not, for the most part, naturally inclined to, get in the thick of things and just stay with it, like the doozers are. And the whole idea in Fraggle Rock was that the doozers never stop working. They just never stop working through the whole thing. The Fraggles, on the other hand, are kind of, they're kind of goofy, have fun kind of creatures. And not only that, but they eat the doozers' buildings. and the doozers are just happy to keep going. They don't care. Fraggle crushes one of their high rises and devours it. The doozers just keep building another one. And the idea there was, we're kind of wired to be more like the Frazzles. We'd be better off. Fraggles would be better off being more like the doozers.
See, I look at it this way. Well, think about the fact that you should be more like a doozer when things don't go your way, when you're trying to make a difference.
Right.
Because
right.
It's the same thing. Is that it's easier for people to tear things down and insult things and do the thing that you don't want to happen over and over again, and it's so much harder to actually just keep working.
Yeah, it's like you say, it's a lesson in tenacity. The very simple, cartoony example of the doozers is really this great lesson in tenacity, I think, because it doesn't matter what a lot of people I've talked to in the course of writing this book, I've met a lot of authors and people who would like to be authors, and we all know, we've all experienced this, who have tried to write or have written books. You get a lot more rejections than you do acceptances for your work, and that goes without saying. Whether you're writing a book or if you're in the writing market, whether you're writing articles for magazines, anything, you get more rejections than you do acceptances. And if you're prone to say, well, that happened, I'm not happy about it, but I'm just going to keep moving on. I'm just going to keep plowing ahead. Like the doozers, I'm going to build another building. You're a lot better off than if you're that person who gets stuck on that defeat and just feels like it says more about them and their work than it really does, and then you can't get past it. So it's a doozers were tenacious little suckers, and I think we'd be better off taking their example.
Go out and build things, don't tear them down.
Right.
You also, going back to, the whole married people ideas, you talk about the couples that seem to finish other sentences and how it works and how it's a byproduct of our brains being lazy.
Yeah, that's right. It's there's a lot of earlier research has been done on memory. When two people are together long enough, they're able to start remembering things for each other. And you're in a discussion with a married couple, and one starts saying, "Oh yeah, and you remember we were camping that year, and where was it we were camping?" The other one goes, "Lake Tawani." "Oh yeah, Lake Tawani." And then we were, and a kind of conversation just kind of keeps going that way, and that arena of psychology research was referred to as transactive memory. And so, as it turns out, that has some other applications. The transactive idea has some other applications where couples are concerned, and one of them is in expending effort to get things done. And so the book discusses a couple studies that have been done about this that indicate that when you're trying to get something done that's kind of a big thing, like getting a degree or changing careers, you benefit from the transactive effort exchange between, that a couple experiences, but in these shorter term, for whatever reason, these short lifespan goals like losing weight or quitting smoking or something of this effect, that there tends to be more of a depleting effect. And what seems to be going on there is the degree to which you unconsciously rely on the other person to, kind of take the weight off of you. And so it's kind of counterintuitive to what we hear a lot of times, which is that couples should always, take on an exercise routine together and so forth. But and by and large, that may be true. But what we have to be careful about is the fact that our brains are very energy conservation oriented. And when there's an outside source of energy expenditure that they can tap into, I call it drafting, like a NASCAR driver drafts another car to gain energy so they don't have to expend the energy in their own car. A similar thing happens with brains. Brains are very energy conservation focused, so they tend to draft resources away from other brains, other entities. And so it's just something that we kind of have to be on the lookout for. And again, it's an unconscious effect, really. It's not something that any of us would say, well, I'm purposely going to sap the energy of my partner because it's easier on me. It's happening without you realizing it's happening, which is the case with a lot of things talked about in the book.
Yeah, I found it funny because it just happens all the time when you think about it, and it's one of those things that I think we all notice, but you don't think about why it happens.
Right. Yeah, and that's what really interests me is why these things that happen all the time and we don't know why, or we're sure that we're sure of how things are playing out, but we don't know how it got to that point, or why we made the decision we did to get us to that point. It's things like that are kind of vague and fuzzy, but have these real cognitive underpinnings that we can investigate that have really interested me, and that's largely what the book is about.
Now, this one I found really interesting because it's one I hadn't read before, which I don't know why, because I read so many books like this. The thing about if you pose in certain manners, that actually can set off the reactions in your brain that make you feel the way you are trying to become.
Yeah, there's been a lot of interesting research done with respect to testosterone release in men tied to the posture that they take in a given situation. So the example in the book was that you're going in to speak to your boss about whether it be your salary or some other issue that you feel like you have strong grounds to argue. And, you have a choice. You can either go into that situation and take a very accommodating stance, or even less than accommodating. You might go in a very sheepish way, or you can take this, more of a stand your ground, not be, dogmatic or domineering, but go there like someone who has a point to argue. And what the research has found is that the different physical posture and parallel mindset that someone adopts in those situations does in fact affect the testosterone level in their blood. So yeah, and that's, we can extrapolate, and there's some research to suggest that it's true of other things as well beyond testosterone. There's any number of things we can tie back to a physical, or verbal behavior that we take that then has the effect of changing what's going on in our brain. It's a two-way road. It's not always, preceded by a change in brain chemistry and then something happens outwardly. It can go the other way too. So that's the interesting thing there. Certainly not advice for everyone to start putting out their chest and trying to be the silverback gorilla in every argument, but probably could benefit from a little bit more assertiveness.
It's funny because when I read that, it suddenly clicked in my head because I've read so many of the well-respected older books about how to pose during presentations, especially in magic. There's a lot of these books that say this is how you should stand and this is how you should present. And it made me think, I wonder if that's why that works. It's that same idea that it works because it puts you into that frame of mind when you're doing that presentation.
There's that, and actually that touches on another area of the book, which is mimicking.
Yeah.
And I've seen a lot of this in the sales world. A lot of sales training is predicated on effectively mimicking your counterpart. So you often see when you go in and let's say you're going to buy a car and the salesperson may be taller than you. Well, it's funny to think about this, but sales training includes things like taking the person bending at their knees a little bit and kind of widening out their stance so that their height is more on your level, so they don't appear to be domineering over you. If your tone of voice is lower than their tone of voice, they'll tend to lower it so that they're more on your level in terms of the verbal exchange. So there's a lot of things like that you kind of fall in this general category of mimicking that, are, they're, like you're saying, they're part of sales, they're part of these, the presentations, the magic tricks, anything like that where you're trying to make this connection with the audience. Very much true.
And toward the back of the book, you have a really good set of an outline of many things you can use to fix that gap between what we know and how we act. And it's a really good set of, like little paragraphs of the things you can remember in the back of the book. I think that part of the book is kind of like the best part to keep the book on the bookshelf so you can always refer to it.
Yeah, because I wanted the book to be useful without being I make this distinction between what I'm writing, which I believe is science help, and what a lot of stuff is, which we typically call self-help. And the reason for that section of the book is because I wanted to kind of draw a bead on the solid, what I saw as the solid, credible knowledge clues that are good takeaways from the research. And I want to put those in one place in the book where, as you say, they could be easily referenced. It's not, there's no system there for success. There's no, do these things in this order or whatever, and you'll, reap the rewards you deserve kind of thinking like you might find in any number of other books on a self-help shelf. But what they are is simply knowledge clues that are drawn from the last 10 to 20 years of psychology and cognitive science research that I think are pretty good. And there's 50 of them in that chapter. There could have been more, but those 50, I think, kind of really summarize the big points in the book.
I think after I read this book, it made myself realize that we need to start having bookstores having a section called science help rather than self-help, just for books like this.
I think there's something to that, because what I've noticed is that there's a psychology section, which a lot of people steer clear of because they equate psychology with more of an academic approach. And then there's a self-help section, which is more fluffy. But if you look at the self-help section, which is almost always bigger than the psychology section, you find some books there that are really good, like Jonathan Haidt's, the Happiness Hypothesis, and Stumbling to Happiness, which Dan Gilbert, Harvard psychologist, wrote, which is another book that I enjoy. I think it's great. Books like that are not in the psychology section, they're in the self-help section, but they're not really self-help. They're really science help in that they're built on credible research, and these guys who are writing these books, and I should say gentlemen and ladies who are writing these books, have very impressive backgrounds and pedigrees, and you find in the books that you wouldn't at the first place I would looking. So, I think there's to that maybe someday we will have a science help section that draws that distinction between it's not academic psychology, but it's not conjecture-based, speculation-based self-help. It's something different.
Yeah, it's kind of like the difference between alternative medicine and the real stuff.
Right.
Well, it's great to have you on, David.
Yeah, I appreciate being on. I've been looking forward to being on your show for a while. And
tell people where they can find all of your stuff online.
You can go to the book's website is whatmakesyourbrainhappy.com, and you can also go to my website, which is daviddisalvo.org.
Great. And your website name is much shorter than the title of your book.
Yes. I had to draw the line somewhere. So it's simply whatmakesyourbrainhappy.com.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To grab a copy of David's new book, just head to our website, see our show notes, and which are, as always, on our website at Skepticality.com.
Hungry for more skepticism? Want to learn the truth about the scientific controversies of our time? Then subscribe to Skeptic, the quarterly magazine Stephen Jay Gould called the best journal in the field. To subscribe, visit skeptic.com today.